The television courtroom had never witnessed such pure, unfiltered greed disguised as maternal concern meeting its complete and utter destruction. Victoria Ashford, a 42-year-old woman who had perfected the art of exploiting grief for profit over 15 years and 4 marriages, sat in Judge Judy's courtroom wearing a $4,000 Chanel suit bought with money stolen from her dead predecessor's son. Her perfectly manicured hand rested on an expensive leather portfolio as she prepared to deliver the insult that would expose her as a professional con artist and send her to federal prison for 18 years. Across from her sat 19-year-old Marcus Ashford, clutching a folder containing his late mother's photographs and the evidence that would prove Victoria had stolen $340,000 from the trust fund his mother died trying to protect for him. What happened in the next 38 minutes would become one of the most viral courtroom moments in television history, shared over 67 million times across every social media platform imaginable, with the hashtag #ProtectGrievingFamilies trending for 8 consecutive days. But here's what makes this story absolutely devastating. Victoria didn't just lose her case or get embarrassed on national television. What Judge Judy did to her in those 38 minutes was so brutally thorough, so righteously furious, that it ended Victoria's entire criminal career, exposed a pattern of fraud spanning 4 marriages and over $1 million in theft, and resulted in FBI agents arresting her in handcuffs as she left the courtroom sobbing and screaming about how unfair everything was. Before we show you the exact moment when Victoria called Judge Judy a bitter old woman who doesn't understand modern families and triggered the most devastating family fraud exposure in courtroom history, you absolutely need to understand who these people really were and what brought them to this explosive confrontation that would destroy one woman's life while vindicating a grieving son who refused to let his dead mother's legacy be stolen by a predator. Because this wasn't just about one stolen inheritance or one disrespectful comment to a judge. This was about a calculated con artist who had spent 15 years targeting vulnerable widowers at grief support groups, marrying them within months of their wives' deaths, systematically stealing everything she could get her hands on, and then disappearing to find her next victim before anyone could hold her accountable. This was about a professional predator who had destroyed 4 families, stolen over $1 million, and left a trail of devastated children who watched helplessly as their deceased parents' legacies were plundered by a woman who used sympathy and manipulation as weapons. Hit that like button right now if you're ready to see a gold-digging stepmother get absolutely annihilated for trying to steal a dead woman's life insurance money from her teenage son. Make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications because what Judge Judy reveals about Victoria's criminal past will make your blood boil and prove that some people are pure evil wrapped in expensive clothes and fake tears. Victoria Ashford had spent 42 years learning that other people's pain was her opportunity for profit, and she had spent the last 15 years proving it by targeting 4 different grieving widowers and stealing over $1 million from their families. At 42 years old, she had perfected a system so efficient, so ruthlessly calculated, that she could identify a wealthy widower, infiltrate his life, marry him, steal everything possible, and exit with a substantial settlement all within 18 to 24 months. Her method was sickeningly simple and devastatingly effective. She would research obituaries and funeral announcements in wealthy neighborhoods, looking for men who had lost wives and had substantial estates worth targeting. She would show up at grief support groups and church communities where these vulnerable men sought comfort, presenting herself as a fellow griever who understood their pain through her own fictional loss. She would connect with them over shared suffering that she had never actually experienced, gain their trust when they were at their most vulnerable, and position herself as the answer to their loneliness and the solution to their overwhelming grief. What made Victoria truly dangerous wasn't just her complete lack of empathy or her willingness to exploit people at their lowest moments. It was her supernatural ability to become exactly what each target needed her to be, her meticulous attention to detail in researching their deceased wives so she could reference the right memories and say the right things, and her patience in playing the long game because she knew that grief made people desperate for connection and willing to ignore red flags they would normally catch immediately. Victoria's criminal career had begun 15 years ago with her first marriage to Robert Chen, a 58-year-old accountant whose wife had died of breast cancer, leaving him devastated and alone with an adult daughter who watched helplessly as Victoria moved in just 4 months after the funeral. That first marriage had been Victoria's learning experience, where she discovered that widowers were easy targets and that stealing from grieving families was surprisingly easy if you knew how to manipulate marital asset laws and move quickly before anyone realized what was happening. Victoria had walked away from that first marriage with $120,000 after convincing Robert that his late wife would want him to start fresh, selling family heirlooms and jewelry that had been in his wife's family for generations, pocketing the money, and then filing for divorce citing irreconcilable differences before his daughter could build a strong enough case against her. That first success had taught Victoria the formula she would refine over the next 3 marriages. Marriage number 2 to Thomas Harrison, a 61-year-old small business owner, had netted her $200,000 after she convinced him to add her to all his accounts, forged checks, sold his late wife's jewelry collection, and filed for divorce the moment his son started asking too many questions about missing money. Marriage number 3 to David Morrison had been her most ambitious attempt yet, targeting a 65-year-old retired executive with a $2.3 million estate, but his daughter Laura had been smarter than the previous victims and hired a private investigator who uncovered Victoria's pattern just in time. Victoria had still managed to flee with $180,000 before criminal charges could be filed, simply moving to a different state and using a different name variation to avoid prosecution. The pattern across all 3 marriages was identical and absolutely chilling. Victoria would meet her targets at grief support groups within 6 months of their wives' deaths when the men were at their most vulnerable and desperate for connection. She would present herself as understanding their pain through her own fabricated loss, creating an instant bond over shared suffering that never actually existed for her. She would move quickly, getting engaged within 6 months and married within a year before family members could properly vet her or before the fog of grief lifted enough for the widower to think clearly. Once married, Victoria would immediately begin phase 1 of her theft operation by convincing her new husband to add her to all bank accounts for convenience, suggesting they update wills to protect each other, and systematically isolating him from his late wife's family by claiming they made him live in the past and prevented him from healing. Phase 2 involved small thefts that wouldn't trigger immediate alarm, selling pieces of jewelry or family heirlooms under the guise of helping him move forward, taking money from joint accounts in amounts small enough to seem like normal spending, and building a financial cushion while planning her eventual exit. Phase 3 was the major theft operation where Victoria would target the largest assets she could access, whether that meant convincing her husband to refinance the house so she could pocket equity, transferring large sums to hidden accounts, or in the case of Richard Ashford, going after the $340,000 trust fund that belonged to his teenage son Marcus. What made Victoria's crimes particularly disgusting wasn't just the financial damage, though she had stolen over $600,000 across her first 3 marriages. It was the emotional and psychological destruction she left behind. 5 adult children had watched their grieving fathers be manipulated and stolen from during the period when they most needed support and protection. Families had been torn apart by Victoria's deliberate efforts to isolate her husbands from anyone who might see through her act. And precious items that connected these families to their deceased mothers and wives had been sold off and scattered to strangers while Victoria pocketed the money and moved on to her next victim without a moment of remorse or hesitation. Richard Ashford had seemed like Victoria's ultimate score when she identified him 18 months ago. A 52-year-old investment banker with a $4.2 million estate, recently widowed after his wife Catherine died of ovarian cancer, and so completely shattered by grief that he could barely function in his daily life. Richard's wife Catherine had been his college sweetheart, his partner for 28 years, the mother of their miracle son Marcus who was born after years of struggling with infertility. She had been a beloved high school English teacher who touched hundreds of students' lives, and her death after an 18-month battle with cancer had devastated both her husband and her 17-year-old son who spent every moment he wasn't in school sitting beside her hospital bed watching her deteriorate. In her final months, Catherine had done everything possible to prepare for the future she wouldn't be part of, setting up a trust fund with the $340,000 from her life insurance policy specifically designated for Marcus's education and early adult life. The trust was carefully structured with her sister Jennifer and Richard as co-trustees, with explicit instructions that the money was untouchable until Marcus turned 21 and was meant to cover his college expenses, living costs, and give him a foundation for starting his adult life. Catherine had died 3 days after Marcus's 17th birthday, leaving behind a husband who could barely function through his grief and a teenage son who tried to be strong while his own heart was completely shattered. For 8 months, Richard and Marcus had only each other, bonding over their shared loss, visiting Catherine's grave together every week, slowly and painfully trying to build a new normal around the gaping hole her absence had created in their lives. That's when Victoria Ashford entered their lives like a carefully planned invasion disguised as a blessing. She had identified Richard through her research of recent obituaries in wealthy neighborhoods, learned that he was an investment banker with substantial assets, and positioned herself at the upscale grief counseling center where she knew men with money went to process their loss. The first contact seemed accidental, a shared moment in the waiting room where Victoria offered sympathy and understanding, claiming she too had lost a spouse and knew the particular agony Richard was experiencing. Everything about her story was a lie, carefully crafted from research and previous cons, but Richard was too broken to see through the performance. Over the next 4 months, Victoria became exactly what Richard's shattered heart needed, cooking his favorite meals, listening to his stories about Catherine without seeming threatened, and even appearing kind to Marcus though the teenager noticed things his father was too grief-blind to see. Victoria asked too many questions about money and assets, went through Catherine's jewelry with an appraising eye rather than respectful sadness, and started redecorating the home Catherine had carefully chosen as though erasing her predecessor's existence. Marcus tried to warn his father, begged him to slow down when Richard announced after just 6 months that he was going to propose, but Victoria had already poisoned that well by convincing Richard that his son was trying to control him through guilt and prevent him from healing and moving forward with his life. They were married at a courthouse 8 months after Catherine's death, no family invited, no celebration of the union, just a legal transaction that gave Victoria access to everything she had been planning to steal. Within weeks of the marriage, Victoria began her systematic theft operation with the efficiency of someone who had done this 3 times before. She convinced Richard to add her to all bank accounts for convenience, suggested updating their wills to protect each other, and started creating conflict between Richard and Marcus to weaken their bond and make it easier to isolate her husband from anyone who might interfere with her plans. She sold Catherine's jewelry collection, worth $120,000, telling Richard it was too painful for him to see and claiming she had donated the money to cancer research when she actually kept every penny. She convinced Richard to refinance their house and pocketed $80,000 from the equity withdrawal by claiming it was for investments that never materialized. She systematically drained joint accounts in $2,000 to $5,000 increments that individually seemed reasonable but collectively represented $45,000 of theft. But Victoria's biggest target was always Marcus's trust fund, that $340,000 nest egg that Catherine had died trying to protect for her son's future. Victoria spent months poisoning Richard against Marcus, calling the boy ungrateful and lazy, suggesting he was wasting his potential, and finally convincing Richard to authorize a temporary loan of $125,000 from Marcus's trust for a fabricated family emergency involving Victoria's mother who had actually been dead for 10 years. Marcus discovered the theft when he turned 19 and applied for an apartment near Columbia University where he had earned a full scholarship, only to learn that his trust fund had been depleted by $125,000 without his knowledge or consent. The confrontation with Victoria revealed her true nature as she claimed the money had gone into an investment that went bad, but when Marcus investigated further with his Aunt Jennifer's help, they discovered that Victoria wasn't who she claimed to be at all. Jennifer hired an attorney and a private investigator who uncovered Victoria's real identity, her 3 previous marriages to widowers, and a pattern of theft spanning 15 years and over $600,000 stolen from grieving families. They found the smoking gun email Victoria had sent to a friend bragging about how the idiot father would sign anything she put in front of him and how she planned to take everything and disappear to Costa Rica within 6 months. Marcus filed a lawsuit to recover his stolen inheritance, and Victoria countersued for $50,000 claiming defamation, still confident that she could manipulate her way out of consequences the way she had 3 times before. What Victoria didn't know was that this case had landed on Judge Judy's desk with red flags everywhere, and Judge Judy had assigned her best investigator to conduct the kind of thorough background check that would expose every lie Victoria had ever told. Judge Judy Scheindlin had built her legendary reputation over 35 years on an unshakable foundation of being able to spot liars, manipulators, and con artists within 30 seconds of them opening their mouths. At 78 years old, after 25 years as a family court judge in Manhattan handling over 20,000 cases involving every type of human dysfunction imaginable, she had developed what colleagues called a supernatural ability to identify patterns of fraud and predatory behavior. When Marcus's case landed on her desk, every instinct she had developed over decades started screaming that this was bigger than one stolen trust fund. The timeline was too perfect, the stepmother's confidence too practiced, and the victim's evidence too detailed for this to be Victoria's first time destroying a grieving family. Judge Judy assigned her senior investigator to dig deeper than they had ever dug before, giving them 2 full weeks to uncover everything about Victoria Ashford's past, and what they found made Judge Judy's blood boil with righteous fury that would fuel the most devastating courtroom destruction of her entire career. The investigation revealed that Victoria Ashford had legally changed her name 3 times over 15 years, from Victoria Chen to Victoria Harrison to Victoria Morrison and finally to Victoria Ashford, with each name change coinciding with a new marriage to a recent widower she had targeted at grief support groups. Judge Judy's team contacted the adult children from all 3 previous marriages and heard identical stories of their grieving fathers being manipulated, family assets being stolen, and precious heirlooms being sold while Victoria played the role of loving wife before filing for divorce and disappearing with substantial settlements. They obtained bank records showing the $125,000 had gone directly from Marcus's trust fund into Victoria's personal account and then immediately transferred to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands with no investment and no intention of repayment. They found Victoria's private emails where she had bragged to friends about her income from targeting grieving widowers, calling them idiots who were so desperate for companionship they would sign anything, and discussing her exit strategy involving non-extradition countries. Most devastatingly, they discovered that Victoria's entire story about understanding Richard's grief was a complete fabrication because she had never lost a spouse or experienced any of the tragedies she claimed connected her to her victims. Judge Judy spent those 2 weeks building an airtight case that would expose Victoria not just as a thief but as a professional predator who had made a career out of exploiting human grief for profit, and she coordinated with the FBI to have agents present in the courtroom because the evidence suggested federal crimes that could send Victoria to prison for decades. The courtroom was packed with unusual tension on the day that would end Victoria's criminal career, with Marcus and his Aunt Jennifer sitting at the plaintiff's table clutching evidence binders while Victoria strutted in wearing her expensive designer outfit bought with stolen money, radiating the confidence of someone who had successfully conned her way out of consequences 3 times before. Judge Judy opened the proceedings with seemingly innocent questions about Victoria's background and how she met Richard, letting Victoria tell her rehearsed story about being a widow who found love again while Judge Judy's slight smile told experienced viewers that she was setting a trap. When Judge Judy asked about the family emergency that required borrowing from Marcus's trust fund, Victoria delivered her practiced lie about her mother needing surgery, not knowing that Judge Judy had her mother's death certificate from 10 years ago sitting in the folder on her bench. The first crack in Victoria's facade appeared when Judge Judy pressed for details about previous marriages and Victoria's face went white as she realized someone had actually investigated her past. Victoria tried to maintain control by getting aggressive, sighing dramatically at Judge Judy's questions and making condescending comments about how the judge didn't understand modern families or the complexities of step-parent relationships. The tension built through 30 minutes of questioning as Victoria's arrogance grew and Judge Judy's trap tightened, with every dismissive eye roll and disrespectful comment being catalogued by a legal mind that had been destroying entitled people since before Victoria was born. The nuclear moment came when Judge Judy revealed that Victoria's mother had died 10 years ago and there had been no medical emergency, causing Victoria to stand up and accuse Judge Judy of harassment and not understanding family dynamics. Victoria's voice rose to a shout as she pointed her finger at Judge Judy and delivered the insult that would seal her fate forever. "You know what your problem is, Judge. You're just a bitter old woman who can't stand to see people happy. You probably never had stepchildren so you don't understand the challenges. You sit up there in your position of power judging people, but you're just a miserable old lady who needs to retire." The courtroom went absolutely silent as Victoria continued her tirade, completely oblivious to the fact that she had just committed professional suicide on national television. Judge Judy slowly stood from her chair, something she rarely did during proceedings, and her voice dropped to that deadly calm tone that made seasoned attorneys break out in cold sweats. Miss Ashford, you've just made a catastrophic mistake. Let me tell you what I understand about families. I understand when a predator targets vulnerable people. I understand when someone uses grief as an opportunity to steal. And I understand when I'm looking at a professional con artist. What happened next was 40 minutes of the most brutal, precise, and absolutely devastating systematic destruction ever witnessed in a courtroom as Judge Judy opened her thick evidence folder and began exposing every lie Victoria had told over 15 years of criminal activity. She revealed Victoria's 3 previous marriages to widowers, reading the dates and settlement amounts with surgical precision while Victoria's face drained of all color and Richard sat in the audience realizing his entire marriage had been a calculated con. She showed bank records proving the stolen trust fund money went directly to Victoria's offshore account with no investment or intention of repayment. She read aloud the email where Victoria bragged about manipulating the idiot father and planning to disappear to Costa Rica once she had stolen enough money. She presented evidence that Victoria had sold Catherine's jewelry collection for $120,000 and kept every penny while telling Richard she had donated it to cancer research in his late wife's memory. Judge Judy revealed that Victoria had stolen over $1 million across 4 marriages, showed evidence of fake identity documents and research on non-extradition countries proving Victoria was planning to disappear within months, and then pointed to the FBI agent sitting in the back row who stood up as Victoria's face transformed into a mask of absolute horror. The courtroom erupted as Judge Judy explained that she had been coordinating with federal authorities throughout her investigation because Victoria's crimes crossed state lines and involved wire fraud, identity theft, money laundering, and conspiracy charges that were federal offenses carrying 15 to 20 years in prison. Victoria collapsed back into her chair hyperventilating and trying to speak but only managing strangled gasps as the reality of her situation finally penetrated her armor of arrogance. Judge Judy delivered her civil judgment with the cold satisfaction of justice perfectly served, ordering Victoria to pay Marcus $125,000 in restitution for the stolen trust fund, $120,000 for Catherine's jewelry, $50,000 in punitive damages, and $25,000 for emotional distress, totaling $320,000 due immediately from the offshore accounts that were being frozen as they spoke. She dismissed Victoria's countersuit with prejudice, ordered Victoria to have no contact with Richard or Marcus, and then delivered the bombshell that she was referring the case to federal prosecutors for criminal charges that would send Victoria to prison for decades. The most powerful moment came when Richard stood up in the audience and walked toward Marcus, falling to his knees in front of his son and sobbing apologies for failing him and failing Catherine's memory by being so blind to Victoria's manipulation. Marcus helped his father stand and they embraced while Jennifer joined them. 3 family members reunited after Victoria had tried to destroy their bonds, and Judge Judy watched with rare emotion showing on her face as she witnessed the healing that justice could bring. Victoria's final moments in the courtroom were captured on camera as FBI agents approached her at the defendant's table, placed her in handcuffs, and read her Miranda rights while she screamed that this was unfair and that Richard owed her for 18 months of her life. Judge Judy's final words to Victoria were delivered with devastating calm as she said that Victoria was going to federal prison and to get out of her courtroom, and the audience rose in a standing ovation as Victoria was escorted out in handcuffs still screaming about how everyone had destroyed her life. The footage went viral within hours of the episode airing, with the clip of Victoria calling Judge Judy a bitter old woman hitting 800,000 views in the first hour and 67 million views within 24 hours across every social media platform. The hashtag Gold Digger Exposed trended #1 worldwide as millions of viewers shared the video with comments about finally seeing a predator face real consequences for exploiting grieving families. The aftermath was swift and absolutely merciless for Victoria but redemptive and healing for her victims. Federal prosecutors filed 18 counts against Victoria including wire fraud, identity theft, money laundering, and conspiracy, with jurisdictions from her previous marriages reopening cases and filing additional state charges that meant she faced over 100 years in combined sentences. She accepted a plea deal of 18 years in federal prison to avoid trial, and having the Judge Judy footage played repeatedly for a jury, was required to forfeit all assets in her offshore accounts totaling $680,000, and that money was distributed among all her victims from 4 marriages. Marcus received full restitution plus additional money that brought his total to $365,000, more than his mother's original trust fund, and he used that money to complete his education at Columbia University, where he graduated summa cum laude before attending Yale Law School to become a prosecutor specializing in financial crimes against vulnerable people. Richard received full restitution for the money Victoria stole from him personally, went through intensive therapy to process how he had been manipulated during his grief, and rebuilt his relationship with Marcus into something stronger than it had been before Victoria's invasion. The case became a landmark moment that inspired 8 states to pass legislation making it easier to prosecute serial marriage fraudsters, led to the FBI creating a special task force for identifying grief predator patterns, and resulted in grief support organizations implementing predator awareness training and background check requirements to protect vulnerable widows and widowers from future Victorias. Judge Judy's handling of the case won an Emmy and became her second most watched episode ever, used in law schools and FBI training programs as the perfect example of thorough investigation exposing systematic fraud. Victoria Ashford is currently serving year 2 of her 18-year sentence in federal prison, working in the prison laundry for 12 cents per hour, isolated even among inmates who know her story and despise predators who exploit grief. She will be 60 years old when released with a permanent criminal record, no money, and a face that millions of people associate with the phrase grief predator thanks to footage that will exist on the internet forever. If you think Victoria got exactly what she deserved for stealing from a dead mother and calling Judge Judy a bitter old woman, smash that like button right now and comment protect families to show you believe predators who target grieving people deserve harsh consequences. Hit subscribe so you never miss another moment where family destroyers face real accountability, and share this video with anyone who needs to understand that grief predators exist and justice will eventually catch them. Remember, in Judge Judy's courtroom and in life, those who exploit human suffering will be exposed and destroyed, and Victoria Ashford learned that lesson in the most public and devastating way possible.
The scream tore through the courtroom like a siren, shrill, indignant, unstoppable. Karen's voice climbed octaves as she jabbed her finger toward the defendant. Her face flushed crimson under the fluorescent lights. The sound bounced off the wood-paneled walls, rattling the silence that courtrooms are built on. This wasn't testimony. This wasn't even an objection. This was a meltdown in real time, broadcast to millions. The bailiff's hand moved instinctively toward his belt, his eyes narrowing as he assessed the threat level. Camera operators behind the glass partition leaned forward, zooming in, sensing that rare thing, viral gold unfolding live. The gallery, packed with spectators who'd come for mundane small claims drama, sat frozen, mouths half open. Someone's phone rose slowly, red recording light blinking. The defendant, a middle-aged woman clutching a folder of evidence, shrank back in her chair, eyes wide with disbelief. Karen's hands sliced through the air, her jewelry catching the overhead lights with each violent gesture. Her voice cracked on the high notes, words tumbling over each other in a cascade of righteous fury. The air itself felt thicker, charged with the electricity of impending collision. Every person in that room knew what was coming, except Karen. But she made one catastrophic mistake. She forgot who sat behind that bench. Judge Judy Scheindlin, 70-something years of compressed legal authority wrapped in a black robe, hadn't moved. Not an inch. Her gavel rested on the wood before her, untouched. Her reading glasses perched on her nose, magnifying eyes that had seen 10,000 tantrums just like this one. Those eyes, sharp as glass shards, cold as January steel, locked onto Karen with the precision of a laser sight. The judge's expression didn't shift. No eyebrow raise. No tight-lipped disapproval. Just that unblinking, calculating stare that had made careers and destroyed egos for 3 decades on television. Her fingers, adorned with simple rings, remained folded on the desk, patient as a predator watching prey exhaust itself. The courtroom's air conditioning hummed softly, the only sound beneath Karen's escalating tirade. The court reporter's fingers hovered above her stenotype machine, frozen mid-keystroke. The producer in the control room whispered into his headset, "Hold all cameras on Judy, don't you dare cut away." What happened in the next 10 seconds would become legendary. It would be clipped, shared, remixed, and replayed across every social media platform. It would spawn 1,000 think pieces about respect, authority, and consequences. But in that moment, as Karen's voice reached its crescendo and Judge Judy's silence stretched like a tightening wire, nobody knew they were witnessing the birth of a viral reckoning. The gavel hadn't moved yet, but it would. On paper, it looked like a standard case. Property line dispute between neighbors, $1,200 in damages, 2 women who couldn't stand each other, The kind of petty conflict Judge Judy's show thrived on. Small stakes, big emotions, clear-cut resolution within 22 minutes. The paperwork sat neatly stacked on the bench. Karen's complaint, the defendant's counterclaim, photographs of the allegedly damaged fence, receipts for repairs. But the moment Karen walked through those courtroom doors, the temperature shifted. She entered with her shoulders squared, chin raised at an angle that screamed defiance. Her purse, oversized designer knockoff, swung from her elbow like a weapon. She didn't walk to the plaintiff's podium. She marched, heels clicking against the polished floor with military precision. Before the bailiff even finished announcing the case number, Karen was already sighing loud enough for the microphones to catch it, arms crossing over her chest like battle armor. The defendant, a soft-spoken woman named Lisa, stood quietly at her podium. Her folder of evidence sat closed in front of her, tabs color-coded and organized. She wore a modest blouse, hands folded, eyes occasionally flicking toward Karen with visible apprehension. Lisa had brought documentation, time-stamped text messages, contractor estimates, photographs with metadata intact. She'd prepared like someone expecting a fair hearing. Karen had brought attitude. Judge Judy began with her standard opening, reading the case summary aloud. Karen's eyes rolled skyward before the judge even finished the first sentence. A theatrical exhale escaped her lips. Her foot tapped impatiently against the podium base, the sound rhythmic and intentional. When Judge Judy asked Lisa to present her side first, Karen's scoff echoed through the studio. Lisa started speaking, her voice steady but quiet. She explained the property boundary, showed a survey map, pointed to the section where Karen's contractor had allegedly crossed onto her land and damaged existing fencing. Every few sentences, Karen would interrupt with sounds, sharp intakes of breath, derisive snorts, muttered words just below the threshold of direct contempt. "That's ridiculous," Karen hissed under her breath, loud enough to be heard. Lisa paused, glancing at the judge. Judge Judy's eyes remained fixed on the defendant, but her peripheral vision tracked every one of Karen's microaggressions. The judge had seen this dance before. The performative disbelief, the theatrical victimhood, the entitled assumption that volume would triumph over evidence. Lisa continued, now presenting photographs. The images showed fresh fence posts driven into ground that clearly belonged on her property. Karen shook her head violently, jewelry jangling. Her lips moved in silent disagreement, forming words the cameras caught but couldn't quite hear. From the moment she sat down, the courtroom felt smaller, the air thicker with compressed hostility. Judge Judy sat back slightly, fingers steepled beneath her chin. Her expression remained unreadable, not angry, not amused, not even particularly interested. Just watching, calculating, letting the rope unspool. She'd refined this strategy over 30 years and 15,000 cases. Give them enough space to reveal themselves. Let the entitled dig their own graves with golden shovels. Lisa finished her opening statement, placed her evidence on the podium, and stepped back. Her hands trembled slightly, not from dishonesty, but from the psychological warfare Karen had waged through body language alone. Judge Judy's eyes shifted finally, landing on Karen with the weight of a closing door. "All right," the judge said, her voice even and controlled. "Your turn." Karen's spine straightened. Her moment had arrived, the spotlight she'd been elbowing toward since she walked in. This was her vindication, her platform, her chance to expose the injustice she'd suffered. She opened her mouth, and that's when everything started unraveling. Karen didn't just speak. She launched. Her voice filled the courtroom with the force of someone who'd been holding back dam water and finally let it loose. Words tumbled over each other. Accusations, grievances, a litany of wrongs committed against her by this neighbor, by contractors, by the world itself. Her hands moved in wild arcs, punctuating every syllable with physical emphasis. Judge Judy's hand rose slightly, a subtle gesture, palm facing Karen. "Ma'am, slow down. One issue at a time." Karen barely paused for breath. She plowed forward, pivoting from the fence to property taxes to some incident involving a dog from 3 years ago. Her face deepened from pink to red, veins becoming visible along her temple. The folder she'd brought, thin, disorganized, sat ignored on the podium. She didn't need evidence. She had conviction. Lisa stood at her podium, stunned into stillness. This wasn't a legal argument. This was performance art painted in rage. Judge Judy leaned forward slightly, her voice sharpening by a single degree. "Ma'am, answer the question I asked. Did you authorize your contractor to work on her property?" Karen's eyes snapped to the judge, and for a split second, something dangerous flickered there. The realization that she was being interrupted, corrected, challenged. "I authorized him to fix my fence." Karen's voice spiked, the word "my" hitting like a hammer. "If her property got in the way, that's not my problem." The gallery shifted. A collective intake of breath rippled through the spectators. The bailiff's posture straightened incrementally. Even the camera operators exchanged glances through the glass partition. Judge Judy's expression didn't change. "So you admit he crossed the property line?" "I admit nothing." Karen's voice cracked upward. "This whole thing is a setup. She's been harassing me for years, and now she comes in here with her fake documents." "Fake documents?" Judge Judy's eyebrow finally moved 1 millimeter north. "You're accusing her of forgery?" Karen's hands slammed onto the podium. Not violently, but loud enough that the microphone caught it as a sharp thud. "I'm saying she's a liar." The courtroom temperature dropped 10 degrees. Lisa flinched at her podium, physically recoiling from the accusation. Her mouth opened to defend herself, but Judge Judy's hand rose again, this time toward Lisa. A silent command. "Let her continue." "Let her dig." Karen sensed momentum, mistook the judge's silence for permission. Her voice climbed higher, faster, a runaway train picking up speed on a downhill track. She jabbed her finger toward Lisa, then toward the evidence photos, then toward the ceiling, as if appealing to a higher authority than the woman in the black robe. "She called the police on me. She complained to the HOA. She measured my fence posts with a tape measure at 6 in the morning." "Ma'am." Judge Judy's voice cut through like a scalpel. "Stay on topic." But Karen was past hearing. The pressure cooker had reached critical mass and the valve was blown. Her words became a stream of consciousness assault. Past grievances, perceived slights, a conspiracy theory involving the entire neighborhood. Her face glistened under the studio lights, sweat beading along her hairline. Judge Judy sat back in her chair, a movement so deliberate it seemed choreographed. Her fingers returned to their steepled position. Her eyes never left Karen's face, tracking every micro-expression, every tell, every self-incriminating statement. You could see it building, the fuse burning down, sparks trailing behind it, everyone in the room knowing exactly where it led. And another thing, Karen's voice hit a new register, shrill enough that the sound technician in the booth winced and adjusted levels. "I'm tired of being disrespected. I'm tired of people like her thinking they can—" "Sit down," Judge Judy said quietly. Karen froze. Not because she obeyed, but because she couldn't believe what she'd just heard. "Excuse me?" Judge Judy's gaze intensified, cold and absolute. "I said sit down." Karen's mouth fell open, then closed, then opened again. "I'm not finished." The words erupted from her like magma. And that's when she made the fatal error. She raised her voice at the judge. The explosion was instant and total. "I don't care what you think." Karen's voice shattered every pretense of courtroom decorum, reverberating off the walls like thunder trapped in a box. "This is my case. I have a right to speak." Her arms flailed above her head, fingers splayed wide as if trying to grab justice from the air itself. Her face had gone from crimson to purple, a vein pulsing visibly at her temple. Spittle flew with her consonants. The folder on her podium toppled over, papers scattering across the floor, ignored, irrelevant to the hurricane she'd become. The gallery gasped collectively, hands flying to mouths. Someone's phone camera captured every second. The red recording light unwavering. The bailiff took 2 steps forward, his hand hovering near his radio, eyes locked on Karen's movements. Lisa stood frozen at her podium, face drained of color, gripping the edges as if the wood might somehow protect her from the verbal shrapnel. The court reporter's fingers stopped moving entirely. Even she, trained to capture every word in the most chaotic proceedings, sat stunned by the magnitude of the disrespect unfolding before her. But Judge Judy didn't move. Not a muscle. Not a breath. Her face remained carved from stone, those sharp eyes fixed on Karen with the intensity of a hawk watching a rabbit exhaust itself in an open field. Her hand stayed folded on the bench. Her gavel sat inches from her right hand, untouched, patient, waiting for its moment. She let Karen scream. Let her burn through the oxygen in her lungs. Let her reveal exactly who she was to every camera, every spectator, every person who would watch this moment replayed 1,000,000 times across the internet. Karen's tirade continued, words spilling out in a toxic flood, accusations about the legal system, about being silenced, about her rights, about respect she was owed simply for existing. Her jewelry rattled with every gesture. Her heels shifted against the floor, her entire body a weapon of theatrical indignation. "I am a taxpayer. I demand to be heard." The courtroom wasn't silent anymore. It was a war zone with one combatant, fighting ghosts, windmills, and her own crumbling credibility. Then, in the eye of Karen's hurricane, Judge Judy moved. Her right hand rose slowly, deliberately, and closed around the gavel's handle. The wooden instrument lifted 6 inches off the bench. Every eye in the room tracked its arc. One sharp crack split the air. The sound detonated like a gunshot in the confined space. Karen's mouth froze mid-word, her lips still forming a syllable that would never escape. Her eyes went wide, pupils dilating with the sudden realization that she'd crossed a line drawn in permanent ink. The gavel's echo faded into absolute silence. Judge Judy leaned forward, her voice dropping to a register so low the microphones barely caught it. But every person in that courtroom heard it in their bones. "Ma'am, sit down." 3 words, delivered with the force of a judicial sledgehammer. Karen's legs trembled. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish drowning in air. But she didn't sit, couldn't sit. Pride and shock had welded her feet to the floor. Judge Judy's eyes narrowed to razors. "You walk into my courtroom," the judge continued, each word precisely measured. "A surgeon making incisions, disrespect my authority, interrupt my proceedings, and scream like a toddler who dropped their pacifier." The gallery sat paralyzed. Lisa's hand covered her mouth. The bailiff's eyes widened slightly. Even he hadn't heard Judge Judy drop the hammer quite like this. "Let me make something crystal clear." Judge Judy's voice remained low, controlled, more terrifying than any shout could ever be. "I don't care how loud you yell. Volume doesn't equal validity. And right now you've just proven you have neither case nor composure." Karen's face drained from purple to ash white in seconds. Her hand, still raised from her last gesture, slowly lowered to her sides. Judge Judy sat back, her expression settling into something colder than contempt, indifference laced with finality. Case dismissed. In the defendant's favor. Costs and damages to be paid by the plaintiff. The gavel struck again, once, final. The sound of a door slamming shut on Karen's entire argument. "Get out of my courtroom." Karen's body moved on autopilot, muscles operating independently from her shattered mind. Her hand fumbled for her purse, fingers trembling so violently the strap slipped twice before she managed to hook it over her shoulder. Papers still scattered across the floor at her feet. The evidence she'd never presented, arguments she'd never made, lay abandoned like casualties of war. She turned toward the exit, her movements jerky and uncertain. The confident march that had carried her into the courtroom had evaporated. Now her shoulders hunched forward, her head dropped, eyes fixed on the ground as if the floor might swallow her whole and end this nightmare. Each step felt heavier than the last. The bailiff stood near the door, his expression professionally neutral, but his eyes tracked her exit with the wariness of someone watching a defeated animal. He didn't speak. Didn't need to. His presence was simply procedural now, making sure she left without further incident. The gallery remained frozen in tableau, spectators caught between shock and satisfaction. Someone's phone was still recording, capturing every frame of Karen's walk of shame. Another spectator leaned toward her neighbor, whispering behind her hand, words lost but intention clear, the shared knowledge that they'd just witnessed something extraordinary, a reckoning delivered in real time. Karen reached the courtroom door and pushed through without looking back. The heavy wood swung shut behind her with a muted thud, severing her from the scene of her public dismantling. Through the small window in the door, her silhouette could be seen moving quickly down the hallway, fleeing toward the parking lot and whatever remained of her dignity. Inside the courtroom, life resumed. Lisa exhaled a breath she didn't know she'd been holding, her entire body sagging with relief. Her hands, which had been gripping the podium edge with white-knuckled intensity, slowly relaxed. Her eyes glistened, not with tears of sadness but the kind that come when pressure finally releases. Judge Judy glanced toward Lisa, her expression softening by a microscopic degree. "Next time," the judge said, her voice returning to its normal register, "bring a witness who saw the property damage occur. Documentation is good. Eyewitness testimony is better. You won't need to fight this hard." Lisa nodded rapidly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you, Your Honor, thank you so much." Judge Judy waved her hand dismissively, not rudely but in the manner of someone who'd just done what she did every day. Delivered justice. Held the line. Refused to let volume overcome evidence. Next case. The judge called toward the producer's booth. The court reporter's fingers returned to her stenotype, the familiar clicking rhythm resuming. The gallery buzzed with renewed energy, spectators already crafting the stories they'd tell later. You won't believe what I just saw in Judge Judy's courtroom. But the real aftermath was already unfolding beyond those walls. The video clip hit social media before Karen even reached her car. Someone in the gallery had uploaded it within seconds of the gavel's final strike. The algorithm god smiled upon it immediately. Controversy, justice, a clear villain, a satisfying resolution. Everything the internet craved in 90 seconds of compressed drama. Within an hour, the view count hit 6 figures. Within 3 hours, it crossed 1 million. The comment section flooded like a breached dam. This is why we love Judge Judy. Karen got wrecked. The silence after that gavel drop was everything. Volume doesn't equal validity. I'm stealing that line, news aggregator sites picked it up. Reaction channels dissected every frame, Someone created a remix with dramatic music swelling under Judge Judy's verbal takedown. Karen's face, frozen in that moment of realization when the gavel struck, became a meme template. When you realize you messed with the wrong one. By the next morning, Karen was famous for all the wrong reasons. The courtroom meltdown she thought would prove her point instead proved Judge Judy's. Volume is not victory. Rage is not righteousness. And authority earned through decades of dispensing justice doesn't bend to tantrums, no matter how loud they get. Karen walked in believing her outrage was her power. She left knowing the difference between noise and truth. This wasn't just about a property dispute over a fence line. This wasn't even about $1,200 in damages or a contractor who crossed a boundary. This was about what happens when entitlement collides with authority that refuses to bend, when volume meets validity, when someone mistakes their own rage for righteousness and discovers too late that the two are not the same thing. Karen walked into that courtroom armed with nothing but her conviction that being loud meant being right. She'd spent years, perhaps a lifetime, learning that if she escalated her voice high enough, people would back down, managers would comp her meal, customer service representatives would offer refunds, neighbors would avoid confrontation. The squeaky wheel, as the saying goes, gets the grease, but Judge Judy's courtroom operates under different physics. Real authority doesn't shout. It doesn't need to. It doesn't wave its arms or turn purple or invoke rights that don't exist. Real authority simply is, steady, unmovable, backed by decades of experience and the weight of actual law. Judge Judy demonstrated what true power looks like. Calm in the face of chaos, silence as a weapon, patience as a strategy. She didn't match Karen's volume. She didn't need to. She let Karen's own words become the rope, handed her enough length to tie her own noose, then simply stepped back and watched gravity do the work. This is the lesson too many people miss in an age of hot takes and social media outrage. We live in a world where too many Karens in courtrooms, in retail stores, in comment sections believe that intensity of emotion translates to validity of argument. That if they just feel strongly enough, shout loudly enough, demand respect aggressively enough, reality will bend to accommodate them. It won't. Evidence matters. Preparation matters. Composure matters. Respect matters. Judge Judy knew what Karen would do before Karen even opened her mouth. She'd seen this performance 10,000 times. The theatrical sighs, the eye rolls, the escalating interruptions. She knew the type. The entitled civilian who mistakes a television courtroom for a public forum where volume equals votes. So she gave Karen exactly what she wanted: a stage, a microphone, an audience. And then she let Karen use those tools to dismantle her own case piece by shrieking peace. The brilliance wasn't in Judge Judy's verbal takedown, devastating though it was. The brilliance was in her restraint. She didn't interrupt Karen's meltdown. She didn't cut her off mid-tantrum. She let the full spectacle unfold because she understood something fundamental about accountability. Sometimes people need to see the complete picture of their own behavior before they can understand why they lost. Karen thought she was fighting for justice. She was actually performing her own character assassination. And that's the deeper truth this moment reveals. In life's courtrooms, at work, in relationships, in public spaces where we interact with strangers, we're constantly choosing which role to play. We can be the person who brings evidence, speaks calmly, respects process, or we can be the person who brings volume, demands exceptions, mistakes their own feelings for universal law. One approach builds credibility, the other destroys it. Judge Judy's gavel didn't just dismiss a case. It marked the end of a worldview. The fantasy that outrage is a substitute for argument. That being the loudest voice makes you the rightest voice, that you can scream your way to vindication. The courtroom proved otherwise. So did the millions who watched that clip, recognizing in Karen's humiliation a justice they'd longed to see delivered to every entitled aggressor they'd ever encountered. The satisfaction wasn't cruel. It was cathartic. A reminder that rules still matter. That respect for process and authority isn't weakness. It's the foundation of civilization itself. Karen learned this lesson the hardest way possible. Publicly, permanently, virally. The rest of us can learn it here now, watching from the safety of hindsight. Be the person who lets their case speak for itself, not the one who screams until their case can't be heard at all. Karen screamed for attention. Judge Judy gave her a verdict instead, and that gavel strike, it echoed far beyond that courtroom, reverberating through every social media platform, every comment section, every conversation about what happens when entitlement finally meets its match. The beauty of that moment wasn't just in the justice delivered. It was in the precision, the economy of words, the refusal to engage on Karen's terms. Judge Judy didn't debate, didn't argue, didn't justify. She simply drew the line, held it firm, and let consequences do the teaching. That's the power of earned authority. It doesn't beg for respect. It commands it through consistency, through competence, through the unwavering certainty that comes from 3 decades of refusing to let chaos win. Karen walked into that courtroom expecting her tantrum to work because tantrums had always worked before. She left understanding that some battles can't be won with volume, only with truth. The clip will live forever now, immortalized in the digital archive of courtroom justice. Future Karens will stumble across it, watch that gavel fall, hear those words. Volume doesn't equal validity. And perhaps, just perhaps, think twice before turning a legal proceeding into a public meltdown. Or they won't. And they'll learn the same lesson the same hard way. Either way, Judge Judy will be ready, gavel in hand, patience unlimited, authority unshakable. If moments like this remind you why justice matters, why respect for process matters, why composure under pressure matters, leave a comment below. Tell me about your favorite Judge Judy takedown. Share the moment you saw someone's entitlement meet its reckoning. Or better yet, tell me about a time you kept your composure when someone else lost theirs. Because that's the real lesson here. Being right and being loud are not the same thing. And if you're not subscribed yet, hit that button now. Because this channel is dedicated to those moments when accountability shows up, when justice gets served, and when people who thought the rules didn't apply to them discover otherwise. We don't celebrate cruelty here. We celebrate consequences. We honor the people like Judge Judy who hold the line so the rest of us don't have to. Subscribe for more courtroom karma delivered daily, for more reminders that respect isn't optional and authority earned through decades of work doesn't bend to tantrums thrown by adults who never learned the word no. Because when respect meets disrespect in a room with cameras rolling and a judge who's seen it all before, we know exactly which side wins every single time. Thanks for watching. Court is adjourned.
I need you to calm down.
Calm down? You're not listening to me. This is outrageous.
Arguing with Judge Judy isn't a defense. It's self-destruction in slow motion. The words fell into the fluorescent silence of the courtroom like a dropped gavel. Cameras blinked red, audience eyes fixed forward, breath held. He was still standing, arms crossed, jaw tight, the trace of a grin trying to survive what he thought was confidence. For a moment it looked like he might speak again. He didn't. He just swallowed, the sound loud enough for the mic to catch. Across the bench, Judge Judith Scheindlin didn't flinch. Her pen paused mid-air, resting between fingers that had ended more debates than anyone could count. Every line on her face seemed carved from certainty. When she finally looked up, the air shifted. Electric, expectant, like the second before a storm. It had started as a simple claim, a borrowed lawnmower, a damaged blade, 2 neighbors who refused to blink first, but pride had turned it into spectacle. He wasn't here to explain. He was here to win. That was his first mistake. "Sir," she said quietly, "when you're in my courtroom, you listen first. You think second. And only then do you speak." He exhaled through his nose, half laughing. "With all due respect, I know how these shows work." That was the wrong sentence, she cut in. The pen tapped once. The audience gasped once. It was enough. From the control room, a producer whispered, "Hold camera 2. He just buried himself." And there it was, the turn everyone recognized too late. Respect had left the room, and humiliation was already taking its seat. If you've ever seen someone talk themselves into regret, you know this silence. She adjusted the case file. "We'll continue," she said. "Try to keep your temper on a leash. It's the only thing saving you from contempt." He smiled again, smaller this time. The audience didn't. The cameras kept rolling, red lights blinking like steady heartbeats above the judge's bench. The defendant shifted his weight from one foot to the other, the wooden floor creaking faintly beneath his shoes. He was trying to look composed, but every movement betrayed the restlessness of a man losing ground without realizing it. Judge Judy's eyes stayed locked on him. "You may proceed," she said evenly. "But if you interrupt again, we're done pretending this is a conversation." The audience laughed softly, the kind of laughter that didn't feel safe. He mistook it for support and straightened, puffing his chest slightly. "All I'm saying, Your Honor, is that I borrowed his mower and he's acting like I wrecked his car. The thing barely ran when I got it." She tilted her head, listening. Her silence lasted just long enough for him to think he'd scored a point. "And you think that makes it right not to fix it?" He hesitated. "Well, I mean, it's just common sense." Her pen tapped once. "In my courtroom, common sense comes after evidence." "Do you have any?" The smirk faltered. No, not exactly, but..." Then stop wasting my time. The words hit harder than a raised voice ever could. The air thickened again. From the audience, a woman whispered, "Oh, he's done." Behind the glass, a producer leaned forward. "She's setting the rhythm. He's walking into it." Judy turned to the plaintiff, who still sat patiently, hands folded over a small folder of receipts. "You lent him the mower, it broke, and now he refuses to pay for the repairs. Correct?" "Yes, Your Honor." "And you offered to settle before coming here?" "I did," he laughed. She nodded slowly. "I imagine he's not laughing now." The defendant tried to recover. "With all due respect, that mower was already—" "Stop!" Her voice cut through the studio like a blade through cloth. "You're not testifying. You're just talking. There's a difference. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The lights, the cameras, the hum of the air system, everything seemed to hold its breath. The narrator's tone, if it could be heard, would have said it all. This was where logic ended and lesson began. Judy leaned forward. "Do you know what happens when you argue instead of answer, sir?" He frowned. "No, ma'am. You lose twice, once in the case, and once in the eyes of everyone watching." The audience gasped, then clapped softly. Instinctively, he looked down, face flushed, suddenly aware that he wasn't just on trial for a broken mower. He was on trial for himself. Judge Judy adjusted her robe, signaling the next turn. "We'll get to the evidence. But first, you're going to learn what accountability sounds like." The camera panned across his expression. A man realizing the show he thought was entertainment had quietly turned into education, and for the first time since he'd spoken, he didn't have a single word to say. The bailiff's shoes echoed softly as he handed a single sheet of paper to the bench. Judge Judy didn't look up. Her glasses slid down just far enough for her eyes to clear the rim. The room felt smaller now. Same walls, same lights, but the air was heavier, as though everyone had realized they were sitting too close to the flame. "This is the receipt for the repairs," she said, voice flat. $380, reasonable, you'll pay it." The defendant exhaled through a forced laugh. "You're kidding, right? That's more than the mower's worth." She looked at him then, not with anger, but with the kind of patience that precedes a thunderclap. "Sir, when something breaks in your possession, its worth is irrelevant. The only number that matters is the one it costs to make it whole again." He shook his head. "That's not fair." The pen tapped once. The sound was louder than it should have been. "Fair? You're standing in a courtroom dedicated to fairness. What you mean is it isn't convenient." The audience hummed, some chuckling under their breath. A camera zoomed slowly toward his face, the producers in the control room whispering cues like surgeons. He crossed his arms. "So I don't even get to explain?" "You've been explaining for 5 minutes," she said. "You just haven't been listening." That landed. His arms dropped. His eyes darted toward the audience, looking for sympathy and finding only fascination. Judge Judy leaned forward slightly, the robe folding like a wave around the desk. "Here's a piece of advice you didn't ask for. When you walk into any courtroom, remember that the fastest way to lose credibility is to try to sound smarter than the truth." Gasps rippled again. Soft, synchronized, involuntary. He blinked, trying to find words, but each second of silence turned heavier than the last. In the booth, one of the editors murmured, "That's the clip. That's the pull." Judy continued, her tone measured, almost kind. "I don't care about your attitude, sir. I care about facts. If you broke it, you pay. If you didn't, prove it. Everything else is noise." The man hesitated. "I'm not used to people talking to me like that." "Then maybe," she said, leaning back, "you should get used to being wrong." The laughter that followed wasn't cruel, it was cathartic. The release of pressure everyone in the room had been holding. Even the bailiff's eyebrows lifted slightly, his expression halfway between amusement and pity. The defendant swallowed hard. "You think you've got it all figured out, don't you?" "No," she replied. "I have it all recorded." "That's better." For the first time, he had no comeback. The cameras caught the moment, the microsecond when arrogance deflated and realization took its place. She turned to the plaintiff. "We'll verify the receipt. If it checks out, judgment is yours." Then, glancing back at the man, she added, "And I hope you learn that talking louder never makes you more right. It just makes you more alone." The audience was silent. Not a cough, not a shuffle. Just that heavy collective quiet that comes when someone has seen their reflection too clearly. Behind the glass, a producer whispered, She's not just judging him. She's narrating his downfall. Judge Judy adjusted her papers. Next, we'll discuss how this happened in the first place. Maybe then you'll understand what accountability looks like. The man stared at the floor, the last of his smirk fading into something that looked almost human. The defendant's voice cracked the moment silence became unbearable. "You're twisting everything I say," he blurted out, hands spread wide as though trying to catch his falling dignity. The sound of it echoed too loudly, bouncing against the courtroom walls. Judge Judy didn't flinch. She looked down at her notes, then back up with a gaze that could have frozen fire. "I'm repeating what you say," she corrected. "You're the one twisting it," the audience murmured, a soft wave of reaction. Cameras panned closer, picking up the shine of sweat gathering at his temple. From the control booth, a producer whispered, "Don't cut, this is the breaking point." He leaned forward, voice rising. "You're not even letting me explain myself." "Because your explanations," she said, "are confessions in disguise." Laughter, sharp, immediate. The kind that cuts deeper because it's true. Her tone stayed measured, almost gentle. "You've spent 10 minutes defending pride, not evidence. You're not here to win an argument, sir. You're here because you already lost one outside of this courtroom." He froze, as though she'd read something he hadn't said aloud. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means," she said, folding her hands, "that people who are right don't yell. They demonstrate. And so far you've demonstrated only noise." The words landed like small detonations, quiet, precise, irreversible. He looked toward the audience again, desperate for an ally. Their faces reflected back the one truth he refused to accept. He was alone in the performance he'd started. Judy turned the repair receipt toward him. "This paper, not your volume, decides the case. The only thing you've managed to prove is that arrogance ages faster under light." Gasps rippled again, spreading through the room like static. The bailiff's eyes flicked toward the defendant, ready in case pride turned physical. He laughed nervously. "You're unbelievable. I prefer consistent," she replied. "That's what accountability looks like when it's wearing a robe." Her tone sharpened without rising. "Do you think this show runs on spectacle, sir? It runs on truth. The spectacle happens when people forget that." Behind the glass, one of the producers whispered, "She's in full control. He's circling the drain." The defendant sighed, half a laugh, half surrender. "You know, I thought this was about fairness." "It is," Judy said. "And fairness doesn't flinch just because you do." The camera captured the slow blink he gave, the kind that comes when realization finally replaces resistance. The smirk was gone. The sarcasm gone, only the faint tremor in his jaw remained. A man who suddenly understood how public humility feels under studio lights. Judge Judy leaned back slightly. "Now, before we continue, do you have anything useful to say that hasn't already proven my point?" He shook his head, eyes low. "No, ma'am." "Good," she said, nodding once. "Then maybe there's hope for you after all." The audience clapped lightly, not for the verdict but for the moment, the rare instant when pride learned to listen. The room had changed. No one said it out loud, but every person felt it. The difference between a courtroom and a classroom had blurred. Judge Judy's bench was now both. The defendant, who had entered with the swagger of a man auditioning for applause, now looked like a student waiting for a lesson he didn't ask to learn. She rested her pen across the folder, calm as stone. "You said earlier," she began slowly, "that this case is about common sense." Her tone wasn't angry. It was surgical. "Let's explore that. Common sense says when you borrow something, you return it in the same condition or better. Common sense says you take responsibility when you cause damage. Common sense says," she paused, her eyes meeting his, "that when you find yourself arguing with the judge, the problem isn't the system. It's your reflection." The audience reacted in soft gasps, the kind that ripple like wind through tall grass. He shifted in his chair, jaw tight, fighting the instinct to argue. The lights above seemed brighter now, or maybe it was just the heat of being wrong under public illumination. "I didn't mean any disrespect," he muttered, but it was too quiet, too late. "Oh, but you did," she said gently. "You meant every word. That's the trouble with pride, it doesn't whisper by accident." A beat of silence. Even the cameras seemed to hold their breath. She lifted a single sheet from the file. "You said this morning, and I quote, 'I don't back down from anyone.' Does that include reality?" He blinked. "Excuse me?" "That statement tells me everything I need to know. You don't back down from being wrong. You double down. You confuse defiance with strength. She set the paper down, eyes unblinking. There's a difference. He looked down at his hands. The same hands that had gestured with confidence minutes ago now looked foreign, smaller somehow. Behind the glass, the control room was silent. One producer mouthed, "That's the clip," while another just whispered, "Don't cut, let it breathe." Judy leaned forward. "You know, sir, I've been doing this for a long time. I've seen people lie, cheat, shout, deflect, but you're different. You're convinced that logic bends if you lean hard enough. That's not logic. That's ego." He didn't answer. There was nothing left to defend. Her voice softened slightly, not pitying but instructive. Ego has one purpose, to make noise when truth enters the room. And right now I'm asking you to be quiet long enough to hear yourself. The audience didn't move. The hum of the lights filled the space where his pride used to sit. Then she delivered the line that froze the air. When you walk into a place built on truth and try to sell opinion, it's not courage. It's arrogance disguised as confidence. The words landed with the weight of finality. His eyes darted up, searching her face for any sign of leniency. "There wasn't any," he whispered. "You really think I'm that bad?" She smiled faintly. "No. I think you're learning that being loud isn't the same as being right. That's progress. If you're still watching, you've probably felt that secondhand chill, the moment pride realizes it's standing on a cliff. Subscribe if you believe real lessons don't always come from winning, and comment below. Have you ever been corrected so perfectly you couldn't even be mad? Your stories keep these truths alive. Judge Judy turned back to the papers as though nothing extraordinary had happened. "Now," she said, her tone returning to business, "we'll finalize the judgment. But I think we both know the real verdict already." He nodded once, slowly, almost gratefully. For the first time all day, he looked like a man who understood silence was safer than one more word. The defendant's confidence dissolved like fog under sunlight. What remained wasn't anger. It was the quiet embarrassment of someone finally aware of how he looked to everyone else. He sat with his shoulders drawn in, eyes low, voice thin from overuse. The courtroom no longer felt like a stage. It felt like exposure. Judge Judy flipped a page in her folder, the sound crisp in the stillness. "You've said your piece," she began. "Now I'll say mine," he swallowed. "Yes, ma'am." Her tone wasn't sharp now. It was steady, deliberate. "Every argument you've made came from pride, not principle. You didn't want justice. You wanted validation." She leaned forward slightly. "You can't win a case by trying to win a room." He nodded once, barely perceptible. She continued, "The law doesn't care how clever you think you sound. It cares whether you did what you were supposed to. And what you were supposed to do," she tapped the folder, "was fix what you broke." The audience watched in still silence. Some faces softened. Others held faint smiles of recognition. Everyone had been that person once, too certain, too loud, too late. He tried one last defense, his voice trembling at the edges. "I really didn't mean to come off disrespectful." "I believe you," she said. "But intent doesn't erase impact. You came in swinging words like weapons, and now you're surprised they cut you back." Behind the glass, a producer whispered, "She's closing the loop. It's over." Judy straightened her papers, the motion like a closing door. "When you walked in here, you thought this show was entertainment. What you've learned is that consequences don't care about the audience count." He managed a small, defeated smile. "Guess I deserved that." She looked at him, not cruelly, but with finality. "Guessing is for people who didn't listen. You'll leave here knowing." The bailiff shifted slightly, the unspoken signal that the ruling was near. The audience leaned forward, the air humming with quiet anticipation. Judge Judy lifted the final page. "Judgment for the plaintiff. $380 for the repair. And consider yourself lucky that humility doesn't charge interest." Applause rose, soft at first, then stronger, genuine. The man exhaled, the last of his defiance leaving with his breath. She closed her folder. "We're done here." He nodded again. "Yes, Your Honor." As he turned to leave, Judy added one last line, spoken low but meant to echo. "Next time you feel the need to argue, ask yourself first if you're trying to win or to learn. One of those goals usually ends better than the other." The man stopped just long enough to meet her eyes, then nodded again, this time with understanding. He walked out without another word. The cameras followed his retreat, the red light fading as the director whispered, "Cut." What lingered wasn't the verdict, it was the silence afterward. The kind that makes even the audience rethink how often they've mistaken noise for strength. When the cameras cut, the energy in the studio didn't fade. It simply changed temperature. The tension that had filled the room just minutes ago softened into something quieter, almost reverent. People spoke in whispers now, like they were in the presence of something bigger than entertainment. It wasn't about a broken mower anymore. It was about a man who came to argue and left understanding why arguments end. The defendant sat in the hallway outside the courtroom, head lowered, hands clasped like someone replaying his own words in slow motion. You could almost hear the thought forming, "Why did I keep talking?" There's a special kind of silence that follows public embarrassment. It's not shame exactly, but recognition. He had just been shown a mirror he couldn't turn away from. Inside the control room, the producers reviewed playback. "Look at her face when he interrupts," one said. "You can feel the shift." Another leaned closer to the monitor. "This isn't drama, it's truth in real time." They knew it would go viral, but not because of the case. It would spread because every viewer would recognize themselves in that courtroom for at least 1 second. Back inside, Judge Judy was writing notes. The robe, the desk, the glare, they all belonged to the role, but the stillness that followed every case belonged to her alone. She had seen it too many times. People mistaking noise for power, confidence for integrity. Her voice echoed faintly in the empty room. "They always think they can talk their way through it," she said to no one in particular. "But the truth doesn't negotiate." A staffer nearby smiled. "You got through to him, though, Judge." She didn't look up. "Maybe, but it's not about him. It's about everyone watching who thought they could win the same way." The narrator's voice would come in here, calm and measured. "Every courtroom has two battles. The one fought over facts and the one fought over ego. The second is the one most people lose," he continued, the tone steady, cinematic. "We live in a world that rewards volume over virtue, where talking louder feels safer than admitting fault. But every now and then, someone like Judge Judy reminds us that clarity doesn't shout. It stands still." Clips of the episode would replay online for weeks. The instant he smirked, the pause before she spoke, the line about humility not charging interest. Viewers wouldn't watch for the argument. They'd watch for the moment he stopped. Because that was the truth. The best moments in her courtroom weren't the verdicts. They were the silences that followed them. When he finally stepped outside, the defendant glanced back once at the courtroom door before leaving the building. The afternoon sun hit his face, too bright after studio lights, but real. Maybe for the first time in a long time, he didn't have anything to say. The camera followed him just far enough to capture the quiet before fading out. If stories like this remind you that truth doesn't need volume to be heard, hit subscribe. Comment below with the words "Respect wins" if you made it this far. It tells the algorithm that people still care about stories where pride learns to listen. And remember, in Judge Judy's courtroom, silence isn't weakness. It's wisdom finally catching up. The studio emptied slowly, footsteps fading into the hum of cooling lights. Papers shuffled, cameras powered down, the scent of coffee and nerves still lingering in the air. What remained behind was the echo of a voice, the firm, unmistakable cadence of Judge Judith Sheindlin. Her words stayed long after the microphones went silent. Backstage, a young intern stood by the editing suite, still processing what she'd seen. "It's strange," she whispered to a colleague. "It wasn't even about the money." Her coworker nodded. "It never is with her. It's about what people think they can get away with, and what happens when they can't." In the hallway, the defendant paused before the exit sign. His reflection stared back from the glass door, tired, smaller, but lighter somehow. You could see it in his shoulders, the subtle curve of someone who had finally stopped performing. For the first time, his silence wasn't defensive. It was honest. Inside the control room, the director replayed the footage for the last time that day. Frame by frame, they watched the transition, the smirk, the defiance, the pause, the look in his eyes when realization hit. "There," the director said softly, pointing at the monitor. That's the moment he learned. "Learned what?" another asked. "That arguing with authority doesn't make you strong, it just makes you loud." The narrator's voice carried the story's final reflection, smooth and solemn. Every so often we watch someone step into a courtroom and mistake the sound of their own voice for control. But the truth is quieter than that. It lives in composure, in listening, in admitting what pride refuses to say. Judge Judy's courtroom is more than television. It's a mirror. One that doesn't flatter, one that doesn't forgive, but one that always tells the truth. And in that reflection, people see not just a verdict, but a version of themselves they forgot to be. Accountable. The screen would fade to footage of the courtroom lights dimming, the bench empty, the American flag behind it motionless. The voice continued. For the man who thought he could argue his way through judgment, the lesson came too late to win the case. But maybe not too late to win himself back. The audience at home wouldn't remember his name. They'd remember the stillness in Judy's eyes, the calm before each word, and the moment arrogance turned to understanding. Clips of the exchange would circulate across social media. He tried to argue with Judge Judy, and instantly regretted it. Not for spectacle, but because something about it felt universal. How quickly we recognize ourselves when someone else is humbled. When the narrator spoke again, it was like closing a book. In every argument, there's a choice to be right or to be real. The man in that courtroom learned the difference. The rest of us just got to watch, fade to black. The screen stayed dark a moment longer before the voice returned. Truth doesn't shout. It simply waits for the noise to stop, a pause. Then softly, and when it finally speaks, even Judge Judy smiles. If you felt that truth hit somewhere deeper than the courtroom, don't just scroll past. Subscribe for more stories where arrogance meets its reckoning. Write "Respect Wins" in the comments to keep this message alive, and share it with someone who talks louder than they listen. Because in the end, silence isn't defeat. It's understanding.